Okay, it's 5:03, and I think we'll go ahead and get started with this evening's event. But before we start, here are a few rules for engagement. We ask to reduce background noise that participants please be sure to mute your microphones when you are not speaking. We don't mind if you keep your video on. In fact, we'd love to see your faces. Additionally, in the unlikely event that this Zoom meeting is compromised by an outside entity, the host of the meeting will close the session and send all participants a new link to resume. During the question and answer portion of tonight's event, the moderator will give further instructions. The chat function has been disabled for this event, so if you would like to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand function, and the moderator will call on you when it's your turn to ask your question. Now, I will turn this over to Dr. Gigi Sakubin, Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion here at Ohio, for welcome remarks and to get things started.
Thank you, Dr. Bruce, and good afternoon, everyone. As he mentioned, my name is Dr. Gigi Sakubin, Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion here at Ohio University. I want to thank Dr. Bruce, Sheldon Andrus from UCM, and Karen Bailey for helping us organize today's event. And thank you for Dr. Bruce for the Whitney Houston throwbacks from the 80s. So I hope you all enjoyed that while you were waiting. It is my privilege to welcome you all to the first event of our two-part lecture series, The Genetic Consequences of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, hosted by our Division of Diversity and Inclusion. Today's event is part of our monthly D&I speaker series that elevates diverse voices and discusses current and historical issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. As part of this series this summer, we welcome Sharon Cooper to campus, who is the sister of the late Sandra Bland, who shared with us her enduring vision of racial justice. Here at Ohio, we understand diversity and inclusion as a key part of our mission to educate the leaders of tomorrow who will make a difference in their local and global communities. Looking critically at our histories and re-examining previously held notions based on current research is what 21st century leadership is all about. Today, we are so honored to welcome Dr. Stephen Micheletti and Dr. Joanna Mountain from 23andMe to speak to us about their groundbreaking study of the genetic legacies of the transatlantic slave trade. Among its findings, the study provides evidence of the sexual violence that permeated every aspect of the slave trade and traces the forced cross-continental displacement of African peoples. I first read about the study in late July when it initially came out, and I immediately worked to contact Dr. Micheletti, the study's first author, who is here today, to invite him to speak here at Ohio University. This research and this conversation could not be more timely. Like many communities and universities across the country, our campus continues to strive for racial equity. All around us, the ongoing Black Lives Matter movement continues to pose urgent questions about transformative racial justice and what we can do to achieve it. Illuminating the very early roots of racial violence and exploitation in the US can help us think about those answers. In other words, to understand where we're going, we must first understand where we have been. I am particularly grateful to Dr. Robin Muhammad, Associate Professor of African American Studies and Chair of our Faculty Senate, who will moderate and facilitate these two sessions. Dr. Muhammad has been at Ohio University since 2005 and finished the last 8 years as Department Chair in African American Studies. Today's interactive lecture will be followed by a researchers roundtable, which we invite you to join, which will be 1 week from today on Thursday, October 22nd. At this time, I want to welcome again Dr. Micheletti and Dr. Mountain, and I'll hand things over to you now, Robin. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Sakubin. Excuse me. This is a really wonderful opportunity to continue the work that we do at Ohio University and in all of our shared communities. Back in 2007, we had the honor of hosting Dr. David Eltis and his world premiere of his database that chronicled the Anglo-American slave trade, the trade of African captives, in acknowledgement of the bicentennial of the abolition of that slave trade. So it's with, again, a great honor to be able to have the researchers from 23andMe come to us in a two-part series to talk about the research that they do, the access that we have to it, and the implications, both scientific and social, that this research brings to us. First, one of our panelists is Joanna Mountain, the Senior Director of Research. She joined 23andMe in 2007 and is responsible for overseeing research projects ensuring the protection of research participants, and developing ancestry product offerings. Prior to joining 23andMe, Joanna earned a PhD in genetics from Stanford University and served on the faculties of the Anthropological Sciences and Genetics departments at Stanford. She has been awarded multiple grants from the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, and has authored or co-authored over 50 papers in the field of human genetics. Joanna spent 2 years in Kenya as a Peace Corps volunteer and continues to be particularly interested in the genetic diversity of Africa. Our second panelist, Stephen Micheletti, scientist and director of population genetics at 23andMe, where he joined in 2018. He is responsible for building pipelines that explore and analyze the geographic distribution of customers. Previously, he was a principal investigator at the Hagerman Fish Culture Experiment Station, where he oversaw projects revolving around evolutionary genetics of fish. Stephen earned his PhD in biology from Washington State University, where he received National Science Foundation funding to study the genetics of species distributions. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to our two guest lecturers and thank them again for being here. Drs. Micheletti and Mountain.
Thanks so much. Let me get situated here. Share my screen. All right, has that loaded up for everybody?
Yep.
Perfect. So thank you so much for inviting us to speak here at Ohio University. I'm Stephen Micheletti, and alongside Joanna Mountain, our Senior Director of Research. And I'll be giving you a presentation, mostly an introduction to our work at 23andMe, as well as this study that we recently published, and then we'll be answering some questions afterwards. Before I jump into the study, though, I want to talk a little bit about what 23andMe does. This will be important for understanding how we conducted this research. And perhaps you've heard of us before, but if you haven't, maybe this is a good opportunity to learn more about personal genome services. All right, so about 23andMe, let's start with talking about what a personal genome service is. Really, in essence, it's just a service that tells you a bit about yourself based on your genetic information. With 23andMe and other services, you basically order a kit and we send you a vial, which you spit into. So we collect a lot of your saliva. You send that off and it goes into a lab where we extract that genetic information. And then we give you back reports telling you a bit about yourself and your connections to others in the world. And why are we collecting your spit? It's because there's tons of DNA in your saliva, which essentially make up your genome. It doesn't have to be spit. There's DNA in other cells in your body, like your skin cells and your hair follicles. But saliva is pretty easy to collect from people. And your genome consists of about 3 billion bits of genetic information, which we call base pairs, that are spread across 23 chromosome pairs. So that's where we get our name from. 23andMe refers to the 23 pairs of chromosomes. And if you look at this image in the bottom left, that's what you probably typically associate with DNA, this double helix structure. This is all packed into these 23 chromosomes, 23 pairs of chromosomes. And there's those 3 billion bits of genetic information that's all packed into there as well. What a lot of people don't realize is that less than 1% of your genome is unique to you. So that is to say that all humans in the world right now are more than 99% genetically identical. But we really focus, and all other genetic services focus on the genetic information that is unique to you. And less than 1% of 3 billion is still millions and millions of base pairs that we could investigate and tell you a bit about yourself. And what can we do with this unique genetic information that we look at? We have a number of different reports. There are health predisposition and wellness reports. So a lot of diseases are underlied by certain genes. For instance, we have a very famous BRCA report that looks at your susceptibility to breast cancer. So many customers are interested in these reports because they could take them to their physicians and show them, hey, I'm at increased likelihood for this specific disease or cancer. Is there any step that I could take to maybe prevent this from happening or reduce the impact of it? We also have some more fun traits, things like eye color and hair color, and more abstract stuff like, does your pee smell after you eat asparagus? Can you hold a musical pitch? All these other traits that we found to be associated with genetics. What I'm going to be focusing on today, though, are reports that trace your ancestry to different parts of the world and connects you to other individuals in this world, both close relatives and distant relatives. And this is what a typical ancestry report looks like. This was pulled from our 2019 report. In this individual, you could see they identify as African American, and they have ancestry tracing back both to sub-Saharan Africa as well as Europe. And with enough global samples, we could trace people to specific parts of the world. For instance, this individual has ancestry that traces to Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, Senegal, and Gambia in the Congo region of Africa. And so this gives us the power to really determine where people have ancestry from, and we could do this on a large scale. So I'm not going to dive into genetics too much more, at least introductory genetics, but I do want to briefly go over how you inherit genes and how we're able to connect people to one another across the world. So let's just take this example where you have your grandfather that's up top, that's highlighted, and you're down at the bottom here. You can see your grandfather has 2 copies of his genome. So one's blue, one's orange, and he inherits those from his parents. So your grandfather meets your grandmother, and they have your mom and your uncle as children. You can see your mom is now a mix of both of her parents. You can see those those genomes get mixed up as parents reproduce with one another. Okay, then your mom meets your dad, and they have you. And now you could see that you're a mix of your mom, your dad, and their parents. And you have all these blocks of their genomes spread across your own genome. Now, the same thing is happening with your cousin. And what we're able to do is to trace the little blocks of your genome that trace back to your shared ancestor, which in this case is your grandfather. And so you have these blocks that are identical that have been passed along down generations. And we're able to implement tools that identify these blocks. In principle, if you have larger blocks and more blocks, someone's more related to you. If you have smaller blocks, they're more distantly related to you. So that's important for the study we're going to talk about because we can go many generations back in time. For instance, if you have a distant ancestor from Africa or East Asia, we have the ability to trace you back to them using your shared distant relatives. Okay, and that's more focused on the product end, what we do and provide to our consumers, but we also have a large research program where we use consumer data to basically advance knowledge in the sciences. And 23andMe research uses a lot of research participant data to advance knowledge of things like diseases, traits, and population studies. And the category we're talking about today falls into a population studies. And customers have the ability to consent to participate in our research studies. So they have to actively say, yes, I want my genetic information to be involved in your studies. And if they do that, we're able to use their information to conduct studies like this. And our research is overseen by independent third-party reviewers that ensure our research, is up to date and up to snuff. And then all the data are aggregated and de-identified. So we never produce research that would identify any individual. And with that, this globe is showing our research participants around the world. There's millions, over 8 million research participants that have consented to research. And about 80% of all of our customers have consented to research. So that's a very high participation rate, which is great. And so as you see, as this globe's spinning, we're going to be focusing on the African continent as well as the Americas and Europe to look at a study. that traces the slave trade. So the takeaway from this is using DNA, we can connect people to different regions of the world and discover their distant relatives. And we have millions of customers around the world who consented to be part of research. So with these together, we can study global impactful events like forced migration events like the slave trade or colonizations. And that gets us to our study of the transatlantic slave trade. To give you just a very brief introduction to the slave trade, it's essentially an economic trade event that occurred between 1515 and 1865. And what was happening at this time is you had these different European entities that were basically trading with Africa and the Americas. And they would bring goods down to Africa. And in exchange, they would receive enslaved people, which they brought to the Americas. They receive goods in the Americas and bring those back to Europe. It's called this triangular trade system. And unfortunately, at the time, people considered it okay to enslave people and transport them as a commodity. And with this, estimated 12.5 million people were taken from Africa and forced into the Americas, essentially bringing African ancestry into the Americas by forced means. So the goals then of this study were to combine genetic data, which we are experts in, with historical records to make powerful inferences about the transatlantic slave trade. And Dr. Mountain was interested in this event or studying this event over 10 years ago when she first joined the company, but we didn't have enough global representation of study participants to do so. So as we collected more study participants over the years, we're actually able to do research like this. And in that past slide there, I mentioned combining genetic data with historical records. The historical records that got us interested in this research actually come from Dr. David Eltis and the database that he primarily manages, slavevoyages.org. And this is a collection of over 35,000 shipping manifests. An example of one is shown on the right here that detail the individuals that were taken from Africa and forced into the Americas. So after collecting these manifests and analyzing them in detail, we have estimates of the number of enslaved Africans that were taken from certain regions in Africa and brought to certain regions of the Americas. So with this, we had the opportunity to actually compare the strength of genetic connections to these numbers that are produced from Eltis's database. And we are experts in the field of genetics, but we did reach out to historians and social scientists as well to contribute their advice and put some of our results into historical context. So we did reach out to David Eltis, who helped out a lot with our study, Linda Haywood and John Thornton, Richard Roberts and Alvin Tillery, who are all experts on the slave trade and populations in Africa. So with this, we were able to put together a multidisciplinary study that wasn't only in the framework of a population geneticist's head, but incorporated ideas and thoughts from historians and social scientists. Okay, so going into the study participant and study design, this is what it looks like as an overview. We utilized our study participants from across the Atlantic, both in countries in the Americas, as well as the countries in Europe that were involved in the slave trade, and finally the countries in Africa that were essentially traded hundreds of years ago. And in Africa, there's about 8 primary slave trading regions that we investigate that match up with those regions that David Eltis described. So you'll notice here that we have pretty wide global representation, less samples from Africa, but more from the Americas. And the whole idea is, can we connect these people of the Americas to the people of Africa to better understand their ancestral origins? And now, if I pull in data that was compiled from David Eltis's database, you'll see what our expectations are. So out of Africa, this pie chart over here is showing that about 5.7 million Africans were taken from the Congo region of Africa and forced into the Americas. And the Congo region, in this case, is DRC and Angola. And you can see on the America side of things, in purple over here, about 5 million people were forced into regions in Brazil and around Brazil, whereas 400,000 were forced directly from Africa into the United States. So that's a huge disparity, right? An order of magnitude more were forced into Brazil, whereas 400,000 forced into the US. So by far, Latin America had more slaves being forced into it than North America. The other very important figure to notice here is down at the bottom, that 12.5 million people were taken from Africa, but an estimated 2 million people died en route to the Americas, so about 16% mortality. And it's not entirely surprising that mortality was so high given how the slavers treated enslaved people. They treated them as a commodity. They tried to put as many enslaved people on their ships as possible. And so mortality was definitely high because of this. And it's amazing that people actually survived this voyage being treated the way they were treated. So this figure is showing our African samples. So these are people who have ancestral ties to Africa. And it's showing that they make these genetic clusters. So this is clustering people that are genetically similar to one another. And these clusters are associated with different ethno-linguistic groups. So for instance, in Nigeria, we have the Yorubans and Asan and Igbo being represented here, and other tribes like the Mandinka up in Senegal and the Gambia. So then the goal was to essentially take our American samples and see which of these genetic groups they were connecting to, and what the strength of genetic connections are to these regions. And that gets me into our results. So I'll start off by saying the overall expectation that our genetic data matches up with the shipping records is met. So if we look at all of the Americas and the strength of genetic connections to Africa, they're very highly correlated. So in the orange here, we see the Congo region. Again, 5.7 million people taken out of the Congo region, forced into the Americas. This region also shares the strongest genetic connections with the Americas. So that makes sense. So this was reassuring to see that, I mean, the two different data sets lined up with one another. But as we dug deeper into the data, we also saw disagreements between the shipping records and our genetic data. So here we actually broke down the Americas into granular regions and started looking at expectations within granular regions of the Americas based on shipping records. And we started to see overrepresentation and underrepresentation of certain groups from Africa. And I'll focus on the United States here. There's obviously a lot of different regions here, but in the United States, we started to see a genetic overrepresentation of ethno-linguistic groups from Nigeria and underrepresentation of Senegambians. So on the left shows these are both heat maps, but the left is showing a heat map based on the shipping records. And it's showing that a lot of Senegambians were forced directly into the United States from Africa, yet not a lot of African Americans have strong genetic connections to this region. And the opposite is true of the regions around Nigeria. So this got us asking why this could possibly be. If you had a high number of enslaved people arriving to the United States, why wouldn't it be represented? And this caused us to look more in depth into historical literature because we were very focused on the Transatlantic slave trade voyages database, which again documents all those shipping records. But there's a lot that happened after enslaved people disembarked into the Americas. And there's less quantitative records, but there are a lot of accounts. So historical accounts, things like newspaper articles, bulletins, stories from enslaved people. And we really wanted to take these into account because in reality, a lot of these help explain our genetic results. For instance, with the overrepresentation of Senegambians, the underrepresentation of Senegambians, we looked at some work from Carney, who suggested that slavers knew that the Mandinka in Senegambia were rice cultivators and experts at growing rice, essentially. So when they arrived to the Americas, they were forced onto these rice plantations that had horrible work conditions. They were rampant with malaria. There's a risk of drowning in these muddy swamps. And because of this, there might have been lower survival rates in people from Senegambia that arrived to the United States. So basically, they weren't able to reproduce and have children, so they're not genetically represented in our study. On the other end, this is the overrepresentation of regions around Nigeria. This got us looking into other databases that document the movement of enslaved people, because enslaved people weren't just arriving to the Americas and staying static. Slave owners would then transport them against their will, both within countries and across other countries of the Americas. So we looked into the intra-American slave trade, which David Eltis has also helped put together. And this documents a lot of enslaved people moving from the British and French occupied Caribbean into the United States. So we think that Nigerian ancestry that was common in the British and French Caribbean were being forced into the United States towards the end of the transatlantic slave trade. And this would cause an increase in the Nigerian representation. Other historians have suggested that Nigerians were part of these there's a bias towards Nigerian in these slave breeding programs that were put together by slave owners. So they would essentially force enslaved people to reproduce so that they can maintain enslaved populations. So this would cause an overrepresentation of certain people if they were involved in those programs. Another large result to come out of this study was lower proportion of African ancestry in Latin America. So if you remember back to my study design slide, you remember that almost 5 million people from Africa were forced into Brazil and 400,000 forced into the United States directly from Africa. However, when we look at average African ancestry, it's quite low in Brazil compared to the United States. So it's much higher in the United States, much lower in Brazil, and basically all of Latin America. And this is unexpected. If we had so many enslaved people in Brazil, why wouldn't there be African representation? So this again caused us to go look into literature and ask historians about these results. And there seems to be a consensus that there were different practices between Latin America and the rest of the Americas. For instance, in Brazil, slave owners were documented to work their enslaved people to death because it was far cheaper to buy a new slave than it was to worry about the health of your slave. So you can imagine if people were being worked to death, they wouldn't be able to reproduce and they wouldn't be able to pass on their African ancestry. On the other side, which I talked about briefly, the United States had these breeding programs, which the horrible title of this book illustrates, where slave owners wanted to maintain these workforces. There weren't a lot of enslaved people coming directly into the United States, so they wanted to maintain these workforces, so they would forcefully breed their enslaved people with one another. And if you have these breeding programs, you would have the maintenance or the maintaining of African ancestry in the United States. Related to this is our sex bias analysis. So with genetic data, since we have sex chromosomes, we can actually estimate the proportion of women breeding or reproducing and having children compared to men. And in general, what we found is that African women are estimated to reproduce at a rate 7 times higher than African men. And this is surprising given that Eltis's database shows that by far there was a bias in men actually disembarking in the Americas. So over 60% of enslaved people were men that were disembarking in the Americas, yet more African women were reproducing. The most obvious explanation for this is the widespread rape and exploitation of African women that we know from documents was going on everywhere. But what was surprising to us, if we're looking over at the left at this orange chart here, is that the sex bias is much higher in Latin America. So United States, there is a sex bias. Anything above that dotted line indicates more African women having children. But as you move to the right towards Latin America, it gets very high, to the point of 20 African women reproducing for every African man. So why would we see, again, such a large difference based on the region of the Americas? This, again, caused us to look into more detail and look at what was going on in these countries at the time. And there's this practice very common in a lot of Latin American countries, Brazil, Cuba, other northern parts of South America, called branqueamento, which was the promotion of intermarriage between dark-skinned women and light-skinned men. And a lot of these countries wanted to actually dilute the African ancestry. They after the slave trade happened, so towards the end and afterwards. And they had these incentivized programs where they would actually promote light-skinned Europeans to come to their country. And one of the goals there was for the lighter-skinned men to reproduce with darker-skinned females. And this actually seemed to work, I mean, based on our results, but also based on census data from Cuba. You can see within this period of 100 years, the proportion of people self-identifying as non-white was cut in half. So there was definitely African ancestry disappearing after the transatlantic slave trade. And that's what this painting's illustrating here on the left, this dark-skinned grandmother who had children with a lighter-skinned European, and her daughter is lighter-skinned, and then she married a lighter-skinned male and had a child, and now that child is lighter-skinned. And you have to realize that this was also, in a sense, beneficial for people of African ancestry, because a lot of these countries have class-based systems, race-based systems, that are based on how dark your skin color is. So people had a desire to want to lighten the skin of their children so that they wouldn't be considered a lower class based on these racist race systems. So those were the main findings from our studies, and I'm just going to wrap it up right now before we move into questions. Just to give you the overview of what we found, there is an agreement between the shipping records and results from our genetic analyses. So David Eltis's database and our genetic connections seem to match up pretty closely. But the discordances that we do find are consistent with these other historical accounts that explain what happened to enslaved people after they arrived to the Americas. Things like increased mortality, rape, racist national ideologies, and other inhumane treatment of enslaved people. And so where are we moving on from here? One thing I'm personally working on is conducting an analysis that will actually provide personalized results to customers of African descent and help connect them to certain ethno-linguistic groups and regions of Africa. So I'm working on that. But additionally, we went into all of these other stories that might explain, say, the over and underrepresentation of certain groups. And we need to dive into those in more detail, because there's so many things that happened over the course of these hundreds of years that just are essentially getting swept under the rug a little bit, that we would love to elucidate. And I also like to point out that there were so many enslaved people that did not survive the voyage, as we talked about before, but also once arriving to the Americas didn't survive. There was groups of people like these Igbo enslaved people during the Igbo landing that capsized ships and refused slavery. And their genetics aren't going to be represented in our study because they weren't able to live to have children that are in the Americas right now. And they're an important part of history, and we just wanted to honor these people as well. So with that, thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm so happy that Ohio University asked us to be here. I'd like to thank our research participants who consented to the research, who made this research possible, all of our advisors, and of course the co-authors and other people at 23andMe who assisted with this study. And with that, I am done. Thank you.
I believe you're muted, Robin.
Oh, I have a PhD in history, but I can't operate. Hi, thank you, Dr. Micheletti. Dr. Mountain, is there anything that you wanted to add as we're waiting for questions to come forward?
I don't have too much to add. I mean, thank you, Stephen, for that excellent presentation and summary of our work. I think there's a lot more to do in the future on the genetic side and on the history side. You know, looking at genetic data through a historical lens, that can go on for a long time.
Yeah.
So we look forward to that.
Great, thank you. And again, thank you, Dr. Micheletti. That was a magnificent overview of research that that you have done, and I think it's generating even more questions than conclusions, and the conclusions are striking. Do we have any questions coming up from our group? I have a few in my mind, but I want to open that up. Okay. I want to sort of step back to sort of a big picture question, because 23andMe is engaged in this aspect of research that has a consumer element to it. And that's a relatively new field. Genetics, historical analysis, not new fields. What do you think have been the major changes for your field within this consumer element, say in the last 2 years? Has it been what we're able to do in terms of the technology, or is it, and or the questions that are coming up from a social and political context?
I would say that the big thing that's happened is the size of the database. That's what's made this possible. You know, with our, you know, we have, over 10 million customers, many of whom agree to be part of this kind of research. And that powers the research in a way that was not possible before, certainly, you know, in the genetics world. And then when you bring that together with this amazing database that David Eltis has put together. So I think it's the step of bringing together data from different disciplines, which is something that I've always felt is really important. It's been long been part of my thinking. Doing that, and then certainly the willingness of people at 23andMe and the leadership to kind of support this and say, you know, this is how we can spend our time doing this kind of research has been amazing. You know, we did a previous study looking at just basic genetic landscape of the United States, and that's we put out about 5 years ago. So it's kind of we have a trend of kind of thinking about genetics and social issues that I hope we can continue. So that's something that helped this story happen. We have one raised hand, I see.
I can't see them, so yes, terrific.
Andrea.
Can you read that for us, Dwayne? Or allow that person to speak?
Yeah, let's go with Andrea. Andrea, go ahead.
Okay. Hi.
Hi, Andrea.
Hi. I can't tell that my hand is raised, but I'm glad that it showed up. So thank you so much. That was super interesting. I think I have 2 questions and a comment. One is what happens, so you have these 8 regions that you lump the DNA into. What happens if somebody comes from a part of Africa that those 8 regions aren't represented by? Does that mean that just doesn't get recorded when they get their DNA tested? That was one question. Another question I have is, do you ever use the skeletons that are in museums like the Natural History Museum in New York? And I think that was the museum there was a museum that went around collecting a lot of skeletons. I'm just curious if that is ever, I mean, there's so many problems with that history, but nevertheless, there are remains in museum storage. And then my third is a comment. What I find so interesting about this is in African studies, most of the time, the way we organize the disciplines are one ethnicity, one cultural group equals one history, one art form. And when you look at these, the DNA of the people, it shows 20% from Central Africa, 10% from West Africa. It shows that people were moved around or were moving around. And I just think that that can really change the way, I hope it will change the way our disciplines are organized, because it's so important to take into account that there is movement and intermixing and interconnections on the African continent. It's not just in the diasporas. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And I could take the first question there. Before I do that, I will mention, we didn't talk about it in detail, but we also looked at the number of connections to regions of Africa the average African American has in our database. And like you said, it's highly admixed. Most people have connections to many regions of Africa. And we attribute a lot of this to the migrations that happened both through like the colonial slave trade, intercolonial slave trade, and through things like the Great Migration and the Trail of Tears. There's just so many different migration events that happened over time that lead to the admixture of people of all sorts of ethnicities and nationalities. Regarding the first question, so we did have very stringent criteria for including our study participants, and we weren't just grouping African individuals by their country. We first performed these analyses that essentially look at the genetic similarity of people. And since people provide a lot of information about their ethno-linguistic groups and where their grandparents were born, all of this information about their ancestral history, we're able to label those groups as, for instance, Yoruba or Igbo or Mandinka. And we worked with historians to figure out where those people would have been deported in the past. So which of those historical slave trading regions they would have been deported out of. So with that, it reduced our sample size quite a bit, but we were more certain that the African individuals we included in this study were best representatives of the ones that were traded hundreds of years ago.
And yes, Andrea, we can, some customers of the Americas do have connections to Africa outside these 8 regions, in which case, as a customer, they get that kind of result. You know, we certainly have many customers with connections to, say, Ethiopia, for instance. But that was not included so much in this paper because we were focused on Atlantic Africa here.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So for number, you also asked about our use of skeletons, and that to date we have not been studying skeletons. We're very focused on living people, or people who've signed up with 23andMe over the past 13 years. So that's been our focus. The skeletons are very, very interesting, but as you alluded to, there's a lot of sensitivity around those. Particularly, there was a study of African-American burial ground in New York. That was maybe what you might have been thinking about.
Yeah, I wrote a book about that. Yeah, that was really lots of controversy.
Yes, right. But they would provide so much more information, skeletons, about, as we go back in time, we could really learn a lot from those skeletons if there's a way to do that in a responsible manner.
Dr. Mohammed, it looks like Kat Kutcher has the next question.
Please, Kat, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, this was a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for sharing this. I have a couple of questions. One is thinking about the role of conflict within Africa in the slave trade and how this drove the outmigration of certain communities. Like, I wonder if you have addressed the political context within Africa and looked at why, for example, Senegambians or Yoruba people were more represented in the slave trade because of the sociopolitical context within Africa. And my second question is kind of related to, I've seen a lot of students coming to me recently over the last couple of years, bringing their 23andMe results to discuss. And, you know, I find students really fascinated by this and kind of thinking more about their own racial and cultural identity coming out of this genetic testing. And I'm wondering, is this really the full picture? Because so many students are saying, you know, I thought I was part Cherokee and now I'm seeing that I'm actually Asian or Middle Eastern. You know, so I'm wondering how much can we interpret our identity based on this DNA results? And I just think too about so many of us are mixed ancestry. And what can we learn about that in terms of identity groups and kind of the mutability of identity across these racial boundaries that we've created and constructed in the United States. And finally, I just had a question about ethics and concerns that have come up about DNA being collected and analyzed, and how do you grapple with that in your research when people are, you know, getting this genetic testing in order to understand themselves, but now you're extrapolating that into this larger study. So those are my questions. Thanks.
Stephen, you want to take one of those? Or
Sure, I'll take the first one, which I believe goes back to migration. You know, we didn't mention as well the 8 million enslaved people that were retained in Africa and moved across the continent as well, and all of the migrations that have happened across Africa in the past couple hundreds of years ago. So the political conflicts would definitely alter the populations we use for this study. We tried our best to incorporate populations that made these ethno-linguistic clusters. But in general, we didn't have any way to control for social political issues in Africa. And I can't give you a better answer than that, sorry.
yeah, that would require a separate study where we look deeply within Africa. And right now we don't quite have the data we need to do that. And we have initiatives to actually, you know, build out the database so we can do more of that. So that's something, you know, we need. For instance, we have more data from more coastal regions of Nigeria than we have for the interior of Nigeria, and we would need to look there as well. So that is, again, a bit of a separate study. Regarding the identity question, that's a huge question in my mind. And we've been approached by several academics who would like to work with us, you know, including Artillery at Northwestern, who wants to study identity and the impact of genetic testing on people's sense of identity. So that's an area of great interest, because it seems like it does have an impact. It may be subtle. And so one thing we want to do is make sure that our results we provide to customers are as accurate as they can be, so that people can trust them. And you know, we you know, aren't in the business of telling people how to identify, but we want to provide them with accurate information about how their DNA is connected to different populations around the world. But I do like the fact that students are bringing their results to you, Kat, because that's, you know, if our service can stimulate students and others to think about, you know, their personal history and history more broadly, that seems to me like a great outcome. Your third point, Kat, was around ethics and the use of DNA collected from customers. And we do have, you know, quite a few customers, you know, we've done interviews, customers who say they aren't confident, you know, they aren't trusting enough to check that box that says I allow my data to be used for research. But so we feel like we're giving them a fair choice. We're giving them choice, and people can change their consent at any time. They can read an art. They could read this article and say, I don't want to be part of that kind of research anymore, and take themselves out of any future research. So it is something we think about a great deal, and we have a whole team of people who are focused on the ethical issues around this kind of research.
It looks like Dr. Mohammed that Winsome has her hand raised.
Dr. Chunu, please.
Thank you all so much. And I really enjoyed this presentation, and I joined a little bit late, but the questions I had were somewhat asked by Andrea and Kat, and Dr. Frone brought up skeletons and African burial grounds, which I'm happy she did, since she is one of the foremost scholars in this area. And Kat brought up ethics, which 23andMe was one of the companies that there were some discourse within the African American community about selling people's DNA results to like Eli Lilly, etc., to develop drugs or to determine what kind of diseases would sort of developed within those communities. And so that was a concern for me. The other thing that I would like to ask about is, so Rick Kittle, who is a Black geneticist, he spoke at Ohio University about, I want to say maybe 2006, 2007, where they had started the whole doing your genetics to see where you're from in Africa. And one of the things he spoke about was that at the time that many African Americans who thought that they were Cherokee and they had some native blood, they were actually white and Black. He also spoke about that in the 1960s, I think, and professor from Harvard, NPR, Henry Louis Gates also spoke about this, that 70% of the Black people in North Carolina were white and Black, even though they didn't know that and didn't look white at all. He also spoke about, and I am from Jamaica, so I'm wondering if 23andMe has done any work within the Caribbean, and Rick Kittles did, and he did work in Barbados as well as Jamaica, and found that a lot of the people who identified as maroons that had a different textured hair were African, specifically from Ghana, from the Ashanti tribe and Arawak Indians. And my nephew from my older sister just did his DNA through 23andMe. And now he is pushing all of us to do that. And our dad is from India, and our mom is Black. So we're thinking we are probably Ghanaian and Indian, and we're trying to figure that out. So I don't have a specific question. I just want to know if you could comment on anything that I just raised.
Well, thanks, Dr. Tuna. That's
You're welcome.
you've covered a lot of ground there, and the issues are many. There's you brought up this worry about 23andMe selling data, and that is something that I think came about because we have partnerships with pharma companies, and those are intended to develop drugs, with the idea being that developing medications is going to be something that's beneficial to people and hopefully everybody who has a condition. So, but one thing I will note, that we don't share any data directly with any outside groups. It's all going to be like the summary of data from a lot of people. It's kind of aggregated and put into, we kind of pull the data together, and we will sell the results of our analyses rather than the data themselves. So that's something that we sometimes find is helpful to people as they understand our program. Now, Rick Hittles, I'm very familiar with. He came to speak at 23andMe earlier this year. Was it maybe last year? He's done fantastic in that. He's done a range of studies from the studies of populations, but now he's very focused on cancer and doing great work there. And Henry Louis Gates, as I mentioned, maybe I didn't mention that today, was inspiration for us to do this research. I spoke with him, 10 years ago, and was super encouraging. So we have had encouragement from people like Henry Louis Gates and Rick Hittles to do this kind of research, and that's partly why we do it. The questions around kind of mixed ancestry and identity are ones we're grappling with at the moment, and that's why we're working super hard to further develop our service so that our customers can have more granular results in Africa, so that we can, kind of bring the results of this study to our customers in a very concrete way. That's something we hope to do.
I'm not seeing any other hands raised, Dr. Muhammad, at this point. Oh, no, I see one.
Okay.
It looks like Karen Bailey has a question.
Dr. Bailey, please.
Not doctor yet, but just like to thank you so much. This was an excellent presentation. I learned a lot and it was very informative. So no question, just a statement. Just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you.
We're almost at time, and I do want to make sure that one of the questions that hasn't come up, that I think I want to make sure that we get back on the table, which is the way in which your research is looking at this in an interdisciplinary way, but specifically some of the findings, or if not tentative conclusions, the way in which you're connecting the dots around sexual violence and future generations within the context of enslavement. Could you sort of, when we're filling this narrative, often we have, as historians and others, we've sort of relied on qualitative information and sort of narratives, but also practices that are ingrained in so-called plantation management. So it wasn't a secret that breeding was taking place. It wasn't a secret that sexual assault and rape were taking place. They may have used other words for it, but it was present. But it was largely in a narrative form. So could you go back and just summarize how you're seeing this as an interdisciplinary effort to fill in the gaps of knowledge around sexual violence and this particular genetic consequences of that?
I was thinking about that this morning in another conversation, and I feel like as you say, we had these narratives and we understood these practices, but when you have the DNA, when you see it in the DNA of living people in 2020, and those people who've signed up for 23andMe in the last 10 years, when you see it in living people, it really brings it to life, unlike, in a way that I don't think is quite possible with, narratives and practices that are a bit more distant from thinking about people and their lives. So, I mean, it's this history is written in our DNA, and I love the fact that we can kind of use the DNA to kind of highlight parts of history that might not otherwise be highlighted in a very vivid way.
And you mentioned qualitative data. So ELTIS's database is very quantitative, and that's where we started to look at the comparisons. One of the things DNA could kind of highlight is that these practices that we understood qualitatively actually have an impact on large populations, because we don't always have a quantitative sense of how frequently these things happen. I mean, we know they were happening all over the world, but this kind of solidifies that, yes, they were happening to a point where it shows up in people's DNA today, and that's important, I think, as well.
Well, I know the students in my class, these are things that resonate with students. And so the narratives for African-American students and other students of color is seeing a gap filled in the history that was largely silent or dismissive. And I think the quantitative data, the research along these lines, speaks to us again in that way, and also provides a way to address these questions from a lot of different vantage points, both through social sciences and other sciences that flesh it out, but have real impact for policies. And I think that some of the policies have already been raised, like, what is ethical? What is appropriate? What are the privacy issues around all of this research? And so that resonates with people. We're almost at time, and I want to make sure that we set the stage for next week.
Yeah, just real quick before you do that, Dr. Mohammed, there is one more question from Dr. Chanu.
Oh. Hello again. I was just checking because there wasn't a response to research going on in the Caribbean or with African people in the diaspora, such as South America, the Caribbean, Central America, and I was wondering if there was any information around that.
We did actually focus on participants with grandparents in the Caribbean and South America as well. I mean, I spent a lot of the talk on the United States because I'm biased since I was born here. But we did look at the Caribbean, and we found in general, for instance, in a lot of countries like Barbados, Bahamas, Jamaica, that there was less admixture. So there was less European ancestry in people in these countries as opposed to the United States. In the United States, we found more European admixture. And we also found that there's a lot of genetic connections between the islands of the Caribbean and the United States. So there was definitely migration going on there, whether it was from the intra-American slave trade or not. But that was kind of our main focus on that region. We didn't look at any sort of physical traits, phenotypic traits like skin color or hair texture or anything like that. It was really just focused on the genetic connections.
One thing, Stephen, you may be able to comment on is within the Caribbean, we saw a little bit of difference between the British Caribbean and the Spanish and Portuguese Caribbean.
Yeah.
Could you speak quickly to that what the differences that you saw?
Okay.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I talked a little bit about the branquamento and skin whitening that was going on in a lot of Latin American countries. So the example I like to give is Haiti and Dominican Republic, which share a landmass. And when we look at people in those two different countries, the African ancestry in Haiti is way higher than in the Dominican Republic. So the European entity that occupied these countries seem to influence the genetic ancestry of enslaved people that ended up there and their descendants. So that's very interesting that there's such a difference between countries that were occupied by Spain and Portugal versus countries that were occupied by France in like England.
Mm-hmm. Specifically, as
We're going to have
you
to call time now.
oh, okay, all right.
Next week.
Thank you.
So one of the things that we want to make sure is that we share with you an article or two to the group, which hopefully you'll have time to read between now and next Thursday, where we'll meet again at this time on this platform with these participants. Of course, if you're not able to read it, don't worry about it. Please come anyway to continue this discussion. I've taken fairly copious notes. I know my colleagues have as well here and there. So we'll be able to provide some of the highlights from this meeting, but also some of the things that were brought up that we started to talk about and maybe didn't get to take a deeper dive into for next week. So again, thank you to Dr. Micheletti and Dr. Mountain for sharing their research, taking on a number of really interesting and provocative questions. And we look forward to seeing all of you and more next week. And we'll put that, Dwayne, are we going to put that article or two in the chat area, or are we going to just send it out to the group as an attachment?
We will send it out to the group in an email with the information for next week.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Sakubin, did you have any parting words?
No, I wanted to thank everybody again for joining us this evening, and thank you to Dr. Mountain and Dr. Micheletti for giving such a wonderful, insightful presentation. And Dr. Muhammad, thank you again for your leadership today. I appreciate that. And we hope to see you all next week as well. Thank you.
Everyone be well. Take care.